Speaking today about digital natives and how to keep up with them, we have Mary Beth Barbour. In her role as Senior Vice President at Ipsos, Mary Beth is responsible for and works with a broad range of clients in the technology, media, and telco services sector. Her latest adventures in research have a strong focus on media behavior within the new realm of multi-screen behavior. With 20 years of experience in this industry, Mary Beth has been involved on both the buyer and supplier side of marketing research. Please join me in welcoming Mary Beth.
Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to take you through some of the findings that we've observed at Ipsos over the course of the research that we might conduct in any given year. I'm actually pulling specifically from two particular studies in principle, I guess. The first is a qualitative study, which is really an in-depth conversation with millennials. The study is actually called Conversation with Millennials. But we talked to millennials across the country, one-on-one, in depth, to really understand who they are. The second study that I'll be leveraging is a quantitative online survey. It's really a robust sample. We talked to 12,000 people a year. We ask them about their yesterday, and we specifically focus on media behavior. So, in the next 30 minutes, we'll take a look at the generations, of course, in particular, what makes millennials unique. We'll also look at media and how much time people are spending with media, different media activities. And we'll round out by looking at digital. And specifically, I mean digital as a destination. A destination for people who are prompted by ads on various platforms, as well as digital as a destination when it comes to the purchase process. So for the first time ever, there are 5 living generations. But why are we talking about generations? Well, there are 2 reasons why it's fundamental to understand generations. First is because our formative years, think about our first 12 years and for certain into our teens, that's when we really mold our core values. And when you think about these approximate 18-year spans, those that are in these cohorts share similar generational values, and that's what we're really referring to. And perhaps more importantly, it's because of these generational values that impact, that guide the decisions and the choices that consumers make as it relates to brands, as it relates to retailers, as it relates to communicating. So marketers today are typically focused on the 2 largest segments, and those are boomers and millennials. Today I'm going to be focusing on the 3 younger cohorts, so boomers, Gen Xers, and of course millennials, to understand what makes millennials in particular unique. So, today this segment represents about 1/5 of Canadians. And in fact, this segment is projected to increase. And particularly that relates to immigration laws within Canada. So most of the people that are coming into Canada fit in this 20 to 34 age bracket. I actually have a new person joining my team next Monday that's moving from Mumbai to join our team. So because of that influx, this segment is actually going to grow. And in less than 30 years, it's expected that this generation, millennials, are going to be poised to be the segment with the largest spending power. And of course, that means they're overtaking boomers, who today represent 27% of the population. The truth is, millennials value meaning in life, giving back to the community, travel, some skepticism, and lifelong learning. And some people might say that makes them similar, to boomers. But they are unique from boomers. And that has to do with the global environment in which they've grown up, and of course the technology that has surrounded them as they have grown. So when you're thinking about this segment, it's really important to keep in mind the context with which they've grown up. The societal issues that they have faced. These guys, and many of you, have witnessed 9/11. You heard about the issues with Enron. I've heard talk of war and some threats for some countries. At the same time, they've witnessed growth in some really strong economies. So Brazil, Russia, India, and China have so much power today. They don't know a world, of course, without computers, and essentially everything is a click away. At the same time, though, millennials are facing higher levels of unemployment. In the US, 16% of millennials are unemployed. Also, they do have higher levels of education. So in the US, 6 in 10 millennials have a college or a university degree. And that, in part, comes with some debt. So typically, on average, this is in Canada, student loans they're carrying student loans of about $25,000. So we hear about millennials, and I'm sorry if this is offensive to some in the audience. Some people might describe them as entitled, maybe lacking work ethic. But in other words, it really sounds similar to what how older segments in the past have described younger segments. Our research suggests that this segment perhaps is a bit misunderstood. I think there's no question there is a degree of entitlement among millennials, but they are so much more. They're certainly optimistic, certainly enthusiastic, and some might say more so than Gen Xers. These are some words from our qualitative research study that I mentioned that really reflect this particular generation. But this is a segment of consumers who value and respect wisdom of older people. Keep in mind, this is a segment that has a close relationship with their parents. They're focused on education. They are the most educated generation and certainly, obviously, most connected. These guys are also team players. They're active in the community. They job hop. They're interested in growth. They like to travel. It means that in some cases they're postponing marriage and settling down. And they certainly like to express individuality and being original. But bottom line is that they are human, like every one of us over the age of 34 in the room. And they are a mix of positive and negative approaches to life that influence who they are. So it is true that there are unprecedented numbers today of millennials who are moving back home. I've heard reference that 50% of millennials are living with their parents, so a boomerang generation. And this impacts their need and their involvement in some categories. For instance, an internet service provider, or furniture, or a television set. If they're living with their parents, somebody is likely taking care of those costs. But if they are working and they do have some income, it means their disposable income might be higher for more enriching activities. So that could be more enriching experiences, entertainment, and travel. Some of my colleagues actually who work in the financial services space have observed that this circumstance that many millennials are in means they're putting less focus on their own financial the management of their own financial situation. And for banks, that's a challenge. If these people are not focused on planning for their future or saving, it's hard for a bank to engage in a conversation with them. Now, this is a cover of the New Yorker reflecting, this boomerang situation. But actually, last year, The Atlantic published an article that was titled 25 is the New 21. And that was describing the delay that millennials are experiencing in becoming financially independent of their parents. So we've heard in our research that millennials do feel a sense of feeling lost. They're trying to find their way. The sense that there are limitless options available to them, which they believe, what they brought up to believe, and there's also a feeling that they're not taking advantage of what's available to them. That makes them feel pressured, it makes them feel overwhelmed, and in fact, it makes them feel like they're having a little bit of an identity crisis. I have a quote here from a male millennial in Montreal. I think we're living an identity crisis. We don't know how to find our way. We're in a never-ending, always spending society. We compare with everybody around us. And it's a challenge to be ourselves. So parents of millennials do play a role in the phenomenon that we're observing. And really, we need to go back a few generations to understand the ecosystem that has shaped millennials today. You know, the silent generation and even the generation before them, the GI generation, so people who are 70 plus, they grew up during the Great Depression. They may have fought in World War II, they may have supported the effort, had family involved, but because of the instability, they became obsessed with economic stability. And as they raised their children, who are our boomers today, they raised them to value practical, secure careers, something that would lead to stability. And so boomers then, based on their parents' guidance, had visions of prosperity, but stability for themselves. And they learned that they could achieve success with both hard work and an investment of time. So they actually were taught patience. Now, in their favor, as boomers were beginning to come into the workforce, be that in the 70s, 80s, or 90s, the world was entering into an unprecedented period of economic prosperity. So they achieved more success than they ever had imagined. And that meant that not only they were gratified, but wow, they felt really optimistic. And they passed that optimism on to their children. Now, some say that as parents, boomers gave birth to the concept of helicopter parenting, you know, where they were protecting their children and shielding them from both responsibility and disappointment. Parents were focused on their child's confidence. You know, they told millennials from a very a very early age, that they can be anything that they want to be. Anything is possible. You know, look what happened to us. It's certainly ingrained an expectation that there are limitless options. And then reality hit. So there's some tension, obviously, for millennials. You know, this is the most educated generation ever. But many struggle once they're finishing studying, not only to find a job in their field, but in some cases to find a job at all. So while higher education is deemed necessary, it's no longer sufficient. This failure to launch, so to speak, into the workforce delays careers. It holds millennials back from other rites of passage, and specifically adult responsibilities. It means that they, in some cases, can be more dependent on their parents financially, which, by the way, makes them more prudent. So when they're shopping, they look for value. They're not going to buy cheap, but they would be very careful about where they spend their money. But this also impacts their psyche. You know, their expectations are very high. And some might say they're very ambitious. They were taught they could achieve whatever they wanted to be, and they actually feel in some cases that they've earned it. They live in a world where their peers are sharing their very best moments minute by minute on social media. But there certainly is a gap between expectations and their reality. It's significant, and that does lead to a sense of discouragement and disappointment, no question. And of course, they're surrounded by technology, connected all the time with the latest happenings. And that does influence what they know, what they like to buy, and certainly how they engage with media. So I'm going to talk about media, and I want to be clear that I'm talking about 6 different types of media activities. So that's watching, and watching can be watching TV, movies, short clips, on live TV, streamed on Facebook. Reading, in this particular case, relates to magazines and newspapers, because everything that I'm talking about are platforms at which advertisers could use to engage with their target audience. So browsing is the third, gaming, listening, and of course, social networking. Before we get into the details of media behavior of millennials, I think it's important to understand how it fits within the context of our everyday lives. And what I'm showing you here is the full day. You can see from very early in the morning to midnight. And I'm showing you the proportion of all Canadians, so 18 plus, who are engaging in each type of these routine daily activities. Probably not particularly interesting, but I do hope it's interesting when I use it as a backdrop to show you the proportion of Canadians at each time period that are engaging with media. So regardless of any other activity, media consumption, doing one of those 6 activities, is more common than anything else. Of course, with the exception of lunch, which seems to be an important period where media takes a dip here. Now, I am going to talk about overall Canadians, and of course I'm going to talk about millennials. In this particular case, I don't need to show you millennials because the pattern is essentially the same. In some instances, we're seeing a higher proportion of people consuming media at certain day parts, but it would be by 5% or less. So it's very consistent. So the study that I mentioned is actually a questionnaire about what you did yesterday. And what we know is that 9 in 10 Canadians yesterday, and we're in field many days of the year, were consuming some form of media. Again, this is overall, but same number for millennials. Very consistent. So a little bit more detail on our yesterday. So on average, it seems lucky Canadians, people are getting 9 hours of sleep. I wish that that was the case for me. Yeah. But this actually does align, and we confirmed this, it does align with Sleep Canada's assessment of what's happening. But what's important to keep in mind is this is everyone who is 18 plus. So in fact, people who are 18 maybe have more time, people who are retired and have a lot of time. And frankly, I think my mom could sleep 14 hours and is probably pulling this up. It is the case, though, this number of sleeping for millennials is higher. It's closer to 10 hours. But we are spending 10 hours, and this is 18 plus, on occupied activities. So this could be working, it can be commuting, it can be communicating. We're spending 7 hours on leisure time. That could be time with family, relaxing, exercising. This number, by the way, is up year over year. Last year it was 2014 it was 6.8, 2015 it's 7. And what I'm most interested in are the 5.7 hours that we are spending with media. 2014, that was 5.5. So for those of you who are whizzes in the room and have already summed this up, you might understand that that exceeds the 24 hours that are available. And that's because we live in a multitasking world. You know, we can be getting our haircut and reading a magazine. We can be spending time with family and going up to dinner. And in the calculation of this, we have assumed those duplicated activities. But, you know, we ran the study in Canada for 2 years. In the US, our colleagues were running a study maybe in 2010, and they took this approach. And when they showed that data to me in 2010, the day was 27 hours. And then the next year, it was 28 hours, and so on. Our days are getting longer year over year. And in fact, 2015 is 24 minutes longer than the data that I had for 2014 in Canada, just to demonstrate. So almost a half an hour. Our days are getting longer, and our lives are getting more hectic. So taking a deeper look at media, this is what the pie of media looks like. Remember, I had talked about those 6 activities. So listening, reading, browsing, social networking. Any thoughts from the audience on the biggest slice of the pie, what that might be? Social media? Oh, good guess, but no, watching. Half of that time, so it's almost 3 hours, is spent watching. You know, we're spending 13% of that 5.7 listening, which is around 45 minutes. We're spending 3% of that time with newspapers or magazines, and so on. You know, if we look at these 3 other groups, browsing, again, is the most common. It's about 51 minutes a day, where gaming and social networking overall are closer to 30 minutes a day. The reality is the pie is not that simple. You know, we have so much choice in terms of each of these buckets. It's far more complex. And this is an example of how watching in particular breaks out, which you might be surprised, given the buzz about live TV that we've been hearing for years and years and years, that it's still the biggest slice of that watching pie. We'll take a closer look at this in a little bit more detail. We also have more detail on each of the others, but we're not going to get into that today. So that was overall. This is what it looks like from a generation perspective. Remember, overall, it was 5.7 hours. And look at millennials, 5.7 hours. Gen Xers perhaps have less me time, less time to focus on media, because they have other responsibilities, be that career, family, children, are spending less time. And boomers, which would include a proportion of people who are retired, are closer to 6.5. The reality is, though, all millennials are not created equal. So while they might have very similar generational values, how they relate to media does differ. We split it into two segments here. So the younger, under 26, versus the older, who are 27 to 34. And this is really a significant gap, a gap of an hour a day spent on media. Now, I want to point out to you the similarity here between leading millennials and Gen Xers. And we'll see this in a little bit more detail on the slides a few forward from here. But my point is that it might be less about age and more about life stage. 27, people are perhaps finding full-time employment or a career. We're focusing on relationships, perhaps focusing on family, and that makes them more similar to the experience of Gen Xers and the amount of time that they can dedicate to media. So this is the same pie that I showed you earlier, just in a stacked bar. It's a bit easier to make some comparisons on a stacked bar versus pie charts. But when we look at this by millennial, particularly trailing millennials, this looks pretty different. Only a third of their time with media is spent watching. You can see a fifth, 19%, the yellow bar, is spent on gaming activities. But look what happens when I bring in the remaining generations and the older millennial cohort. So they are spending more time watching, right, 45 to 36. And in fact, the amount of time spent watching increases with age. But notice how the amount of time spent gaming is declining as people age. So if we're thinking about all millennials as being major heavy gamers, that's not necessarily the case. So in terms of watching, that was half of all media time, right? And this is, sorry, let me go back one. This is that detail I showed you earlier. I've reproportioned it, so it totals 100%. But half of what people are watching today is live. So we did this study I mentioned in 2014 and 2015. So in 2014, live TV was 55%. So not drastically different, right? Compared to so much buzz. There's no question that there is some erosion, but it's not necessarily as drastic as you might think. It's a slow process. So this shift from 55 to 51 is 4%. 4 percentage points, which actually represents a difference of 7%. What we've seen, though, with streaming and downloading content, in 2014, this number was 15%. So that means it's up by 60%. So if it's live TV only dropped 7%, but streaming is increasing by 60%, where is it pulling from? And it's principally coming from time with PVR'd content. That's what's being impacted the most. So I do want to give a little bit of focus to those different forms of watching. There's two in particular I want to highlight for you. And this is a little bit like Psych 101. When you go to university, you maybe know this, but you don't think of it in this way. So we all know that, of course, trailing millennials are spending less time watching live TV. In fact, it's only 7% of all of their media time throughout the day. And that's, if we compare it to our oldest generation, there's a ratio of 5. Boomers proportionately are spending 5%, 5 times as much time with live TV. The inverse is true when we look at streaming and downloading content. It's a relationship of 4. So trailing millennials are spending 4 times as much time with this type of content. Just conscious of time, so I'm going to scroll through a few of these, actually. Social networking. This is represents 9% of our time with media a day, so about overall half an hour. This can take different forms, of course, looking at comments, looking at pictures and videos. Other here is really gaming, think Candy Crush on Facebook, that type of thing. But of course, time with brands. So 2 points here. One is if you look at comments and pictures, we're much more voyeuristic, looking at other people's comments or pictures and videos, and less time we're posting our own. One other interesting point we've seen is actually that time spent with browsing images and pictures is up year over year. Let me just grab that number. Yes, so today this is 24% combined, but in 2014 it was 18% of all social networking activities were focused on pictures and videos. Now, I used to show this slide in 2014 because it was a great story. What it was pulling out, or what it was showing in 2014, was that millennials were much more engaged in brand engagement in a social media environment than any other age cohort. But the data for 2015 doesn't support that. So I was going to pull it, and I thought, well, wait a minute, I think there's a finding in here, because while they're not different, it does demonstrate that they are embracing this, and that goes up funnel. You know, that impacts people who are older in terms of how they shop, how they browse, and how they feel about engaging with a brand in a non-traditional environment. So I want to talk about digital. Specifically as it relates to advertising, creating a call to action. I'm showing you here 7 different platforms where advertising could appear. And what I'm looking at would be the proportion of people who indicate that after seeing an ad on any one of these platforms, how many on a weekly basis or more often will go online to find more information. 35%, so a third of people indicate after seeing an ad, and this is overall, will go online to find more information. That drops when we think about radio and newspaper. What's interesting is internet now, I mean, you're online and you're going online for more information, but that number now exceeds television in terms of creating a call to action. As you might imagine, this does vary considerably by generation. Look at the 2 millennial segments here, and note trailing millennials in particularly. They're both elevated, but trailing millennials are much higher. Gen Xers are higher on a few, and boomers are not higher on anything. The one last data point I want to share with you relates to digital and the role it plays in the purchase process. And specifically, I'm talking about research. Now, I just showed you numbers that was behavior that was based on a weekly basis or more. This is actually monthly or more often. So 68% of Canadians, all Canadians, will research online in any given month. And that, of course, does vary by generation. You'll note here it's higher for the 2 millennial segments. We also look at purchasing online on a monthly basis. Again, much more dominant when we're talking about millennials. And if we do some, what I call consultant math, and we just look at the ratio between those people who are researching and those people who are making a purchase, it further supports that this segment is by far leading the older segments as it relates to embracing digital in the purchase process. So I want to wrap up leaving you with 5 points that highlight why millennials are unique in ways that make it important for you to consider them differently. You know, the first relates to millennials. They expect to be heard. And you can actually facilitate their participation in the development of ideas through social media, through online communities, could be real time, or market research, if you wanted to chat with me. But there's an opportunity for you to encourage millennials, as marketers, to encourage millennials to get more involved in this experience that you provide, create a dialogue, allow them to contribute to the design, to the promotion of what you're offering. Encourage them to join you in the experience that you're delivering. Secondly, it's true that millennials can feel overwhelmed by all the options that are available to them. So help them gain control by simplifying and curating options that allow them to customize and personalize what they're buying, giving them some choice, Simplifying the process is certainly an attractive situation for them and will make them more likely to convert. Third point relates to authenticity. So brands that stand for something which hold true to their values are more meaningful to millennials. If you can truly stand behind something, and your brand will resonate more deeply with this age group. They have a strong desire for culture and authenticity. They're going to seek that out. Bringing the human element to your brand is important. It helps them connect to see the people behind the brand, the process, your story, the history, where it came from. It's really important that your messaging and communication, however, is truthful, because these guys are savvy, and the next option is only a click away. It's important to understand and keep in mind their relationship with technology. They rely heavily to collect information, to check prices, to look for reviews. And while they rely heavily on digital, we know that they do have a very close relationship with their parents, who have their own set of influences. So it's important to think about this segment not only from a digital perspective, so non-traditional sources, but traditional resources will play a role. So you need to consider multiple touch points in your communication. And related to this, millennials place great importance on trusted advisors. They're going to turn to both their peers, but also to strangers online for advice, for testimonials, before they make a purchase. So their network is broad. For marketers, if you can tap into this network, it will lend credibility. Word of mouth is key, and it's held in high regard here. So embrace that. Don't discount it. And certainly, brands are expected to join the conversation, so not something to stay away from. And lastly, when we're thinking about millennials, it's important to consider that not all millennials are created equally. If we look at those differences between trailing millennials and leading millennials, there are key differences. And if you're thinking about millennials who perhaps have the most buying power, that might be the older millennials, 27 plus, the reality is their values might be very similar to trailing millennials, but how they're engaging with media reflects Gen Xers. So there's likely an opportunity for you to be more efficient in terms of your media placement when you're connecting with those two older segments.